What if I told you that on May 5th, 1945, 3 days before Germany's surrender, American soldiers, German Wehrmacht troops, and French VIP prisoners fought together to defend an Austrian castle against a Waffen-SS assault? That this bizarre alliance included a Wehrmacht officer who defected, an American tank commander who charged into enemy territory alone, former French prime ministers fighting alongside their former captors, and a castle full of prisoners who'd been hostages of the Nazi regime? That this battle, the only time in World War II that Americans and Germans fought as allies, happened after Hitler's death, after Berlin had fallen, and after the war was essentially over, yet somehow became one of the war's most desperate last stands? This is the story of the Battle of Castle Itter, the strangest, most improbable battle of World War II. And the darkest part? It happened because even as Nazi Germany collapsed, fanatical SS troops refused to accept defeat and were willing to murder prisoners rather than let them be liberated. Castle Itter sits on a hilltop in the Austrian Alps, about 4 miles from the town of Virgil in Tyrol. Built in the 13th century, it had served various purposes over the centuries: fortress, residence, luxury hotel. In 1943, the Nazi regime requisitioned it for a new purpose: a VIP prison for high-value French hostages. Unlike concentration camps designed for extermination or brutal labor, Castle Itter was a gilded cage. The prisoners held there were too politically important to simply murder, at least while the war was going Germany's way. The Nazis believed these prisoners might be useful as bargaining chips for negotiations or prisoner exchanges. The prisoners. By May 1945, Castle Itter held an extraordinary collection of French political and military leaders: Édouard Daladier, former Prime Minister of France, 1938 to 1940, the man who'd signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler. The Nazis blamed him for France's resistance to German domination and imprisoned him as a symbol of the old France they despised. Paul Reynaud, Prime Minister of France in 1940 when France fell. He'd refused to surrender and wanted to continue fighting from North Africa. For this, the Nazis considered him a dangerous symbol of French resistance. Maurice Gamelin, Commander-in-Chief of French forces in 1940. The Nazis blamed him for France's military disaster, but also recognized his symbolic importance as France's top general. Maxime Weygand, Gamelin's successor as French Commander-in-Chief, a legendary military figure who'd served since World War I. François de la Roque, leader of the right-wing Croix de Feu movement before the war. Despite his right-wing politics, he'd opposed Nazi collaboration, leading to his arrest. Jean Borotra, a French tennis champion, one of the four musketeers who dominated tennis in the 1920s and 1930s. He'd been a minor Vichy official who'd turned against collaboration. Michel Clemenceau, son of Georges Clemenceau, France's legendary World War I prime minister. Imprisoned for his family name and anti-Nazi activity. Marie-Agnès Caillot, sister of Charles de Gaulle, imprisoned because of her brother's resistance leadership. Also imprisoned were various family members, aides, and associates of these prisoners, a total of approximately 14 to 18 people, depending on the exact date. The conditions. Unlike concentration camp prisoners, the Castle Itter hostages lived in relative comfort. They had adequate food, by wartime standards. They had individual or shared rooms, not barracks. They had some freedom of movement within the castle. They could read, exercise, and socialize. They were not subjected to forced labor or systematic violence, but they were prisoners nonetheless. They were guarded by SS troops. They had no contact with the outside world. Their future was uncertain. They could be executed at any moment if Berlin ordered it. They watched from their castle as the war turned against Germany, knowing their fate depended on unpredictable Nazi decisions. By late April 1945, as Allied forces approached Austria and Nazi Germany collapsed, the prisoners recognized a new danger. The SS guards might murder them rather than let them be liberated. The prisoners began planning for this contingency, preparing to defend themselves if necessary. Then on April 30th, 1945, something unexpected happened. April 30th, 1945. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. The Nazi regime was effectively decapitated. At Castle Itter, the SS guards, recognizing that the war was lost, deserted during the night, fleeing to avoid capture by Allied forces. The prisoners woke on May 1st to find themselves unguarded. They were free, but stranded in a castle in the middle of still hostile territory, with rogue SS units roaming the countryside and no clear way to reach Allied lines safely. The cook's mission, the castle's cook, Andreas Krobot, a Czech who'd been forced to work for the SS, volunteered to bicycle to the nearby town of Virgil to seek help. Virgil had been liberated by advancing American forces. If Krobot could reach the Americans and convince them of the situation, they might send a rescue force. Krobot pedaled approximately 4 miles through Austrian countryside where Wehrmacht remnants and SS diehards were still operating. He made it to Virgil and found American forces from the U.S. 12th Armored Division. The Americans were skeptical. A Czech cook claiming French VYP prisoners needed rescue from a castle? It sounded absurd, but Krobot was persuasive, and the Americans decided to investigate. The unlikely alliance. Meanwhile, another bizarre development was occurring. Major Josef Sepp Gongol, a Wehrmacht officer commanding a small unit in the Virgil area, had already decided the war was over and that continuing to fight for Nazi Germany was pointless and immoral. Gongol had quietly begun cooperating with the Austrian resistance. When he heard about the situation at Castle Itter, French VSP prisoners at risk from rogue SS units, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. He would help rescue them. Gongol contacted the Austrian resistance, who contacted American forces. When the Americans learned that a Wehrmacht officer was offering to help, they were initially suspicious. Was this a trap? But Gongol's information matched Krobot's report. The situation appeared genuine. The tank commander, Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr., commanding a small detachment of the 12th Armored Division, was tasked with the rescue. Lee had approximately 14 men available, a tiny force for a combat mission into potentially hostile territory. But he also had one critical asset, an M4 Sherman tank nicknamed Besotten Jenny. Lee made a characteristically bold decision. He would take the tank and a handful of men and drive directly to Castle Itter, approximately 4 miles into territory that might still be held by German forces. This was tactically insane. A single tank separated from its unit, with minimal infantry support, driving through potentially hostile territory to rescue prisoners based on reports from a Czech cook and a defecting Wehrmacht officer. But Lee was a combat veteran who developed a reputation for aggressive, unconventional tactics. He loaded his men into and onto the Sherman tank and headed for Castle Itter. May 4th, 1945. Lee's small force, one Sherman tank and about a dozen soldiers, arrived at Castle Itter. They found the French 5 IP prisoners anxious but unharmed, Major Gongol and approximately 10 to 15 Wehrmacht soldiers who'd joined him in defecting, Andreas Krobot and some Austrian resistance members, a medieval castle with thick stone walls but no modern fortifications. Lee assessed the situation. Castle Itter was defensible. Thick walls, elevated position, limited approaches. But it was vulnerable to determined assault, especially from troops with Panzerfausts, anti-tank weapons, and artillery. And intelligence reports suggested that Waffen-SS units in the area were not surrendering. Some were fleeing toward Alpine redoubts. Others were executing prisoners and deserters before melting away. Lee learned that a substantial SS force, possibly 100 to 200 troops, was in the area and might attempt to storm the castle to kill the prisoners rather than let them be liberated. The decision. Lee made a series of rapid decisions. 1. Defend the castle. Rather than evacuate the prisoners immediately, which would expose them to ambush during the journey, he would fortify the castle and defend it if attacked. 2. Accept Gongol's help. Despite the extraordinary circumstance of allying with German soldiers, Lee recognized that Gongol's men doubled his defensive force, and Gongol knew the local terrain. 3. Arm the prisoners. The French prisoners included several military officers. Lee decided to arm them with weapons from Gangel's soldiers and from the castle's stores. 4. Position the Sherman. Lee placed his tank, the most powerful weapon available, at the castle's main gate where it could cover the primary approach. 5. Prepare for siege. Lee's men and Gangel's Wehrmacht soldiers worked together to fortify the castle, positioning machine guns, creating firing positions, stockpiling ammunition. The unprecedented alliance. What happened next was unprecedented in World War II. American soldiers and German Wehrmacht troops worked side by side preparing defensive positions. French prisoners, former prime ministers and generals, manned rifles and machine guns. A Wehrmacht major, Gangel, and an American captain, Lee, jointly planned the defense. Austrian resistance fighters served as scouts and runners. Everyone involved recognized the absurdity of the situation. Days earlier, these men would have been trying to kill each other. Now they were preparing to fight together against Waffen-SS fanatics who refused to accept Germany's defeat. The prisoners were simultaneously their protectors and their former enemies. The Americans were allied with Germans. The Germans were defying their own former comrades. It was by any measure the strangest alliance of the entire war. May 5th, 1945. Dawn. The SS assault began with mortar and small arms fire from the surrounding forest. Approximately 100 to 200 Waffen-SS troops, remnants of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, had assembled during the night. Their commander reportedly stated that the prisoners were traitors to Germany, who must be eliminated before Allied forces could use them for propaganda. This was fanaticism in its purest form. The war was over. Germany had surrendered, but these SS troops refused to accept reality. The first wave. The initial SS assault targeted the castle's main gate, where Lee had positioned his Sherman tank. SS troops advanced through the forest, firing Panzerfaust, anti-tank rockets, and machine guns. The Sherman's 75mm gun and .50 caliber machine gun opened fire, devastating the SS advance. Several SS soldiers were killed in the initial exchange, but the SS had Panzerfausts, and eventually one struck home. A Panzerfaust hit the Sherman, disabling it. The tank couldn't move, though its main gun and machine gun remained operational. Lee's crew continued fighting from the immobilized tank, but the castle's primary weapon was now a stationary pillbox rather than a mobile asset. The French fighters, inside the castle, the French prisoners fought alongside their unexpected allies. Jean Borotra, the tennis champion, volunteered for a desperate mission. He would climb over the castle wall, run through SS-controlled territory, and reach American lines to request reinforcements. Borotra was 46 years old. He hadn't been a soldier, but he was in excellent physical condition from his athletic career, and he volunteered for a mission that had a high probability of getting him killed. He made it. Running and dodging through forest and fields while SS troops fired at him, Borotra reached American lines and requested immediate reinforcements for Castle Itter. Paul Reynaud, the former prime minister, manned a rifle, firing at SS troops from castle windows. The symbolic power was profound. A man who'd led France at its moment of greatest crisis was now personally fighting against the remnants of the regime that had destroyed his country. Other prisoners took firing positions, reloaded weapons, and helped tend wounded. The defense. The combined force defended the castle throughout the day. American soldiers held the gate and main walls. Wehrmacht soldiers under Gangel fought alongside them. French prisoners supplemented the defense. Austrian resistance members served as scouts and ammunition runners. The defense was desperate and confused. SS troops repeatedly attempted to storm the walls. Machine gun fire echoed through the valleys. The castle walls, built to withstand medieval siege weapons, proved reasonably effective against 20th century small arms, though mortar fire damaged sections. The casualties. Around midday during an SS push toward the castle gate, Major Joseph Gangel was killed by sniper fire. He died defending French prisoners against his own countrymen. A Wehrmacht officer who'd chosen conscience over loyalty to a collapsing regime. Several American soldiers were wounded. Casualties among the French prisoners were minimal. Lee and Gangel had positioned them in the most protected areas, but they were at constant risk from SS fire. The Wehrmacht soldiers fighting alongside the Americans fought with desperate determination. They were traitors in SS eyes, and if captured, they'd be executed. By mid-afternoon, the situation was deteriorating. The defenders were running low on ammunition. The disabled Sherman was nearly out of shells. The SS was preparing for another major assault. If reinforcements didn't arrive soon, the castle would fall. Then, around 4 p.m., American forces arrived. Alerted by Jean Bouratra and by other reports, elements of the U.S. 142nd Infantry Regiment and the 12th Armored Division advanced on Castle Itter. The arrival of American troops with tanks, artillery, and overwhelming numbers shattered the SS assault. SS troops, recognizing they now faced a force they couldn't defeat, retreated into the surrounding forest. Some escaped. Others were captured. A few died in the final exchanges of fire. By evening, Castle Itter was secure. The French prisoners were safe. The American soldiers had held. The Wehrmacht defectors had proven their loyalty to a cause beyond the Nazi regime. And one of the strangest battles of World War II was over. The aftermath. The French prisoners were evacuated to safety and eventually repatriated to France, where many resumed political careers. The American soldiers received commendations for their courage in conducting a desperate rescue mission with minimal forces. The Wehrmacht soldiers who'd defected faced an uncertain future. They'd betrayed the Nazi regime, but they were still German soldiers in American custody. Major Gangel, who died defending the castle, was buried with military honors. The town of Wurgl later named a street after him, one of the few Wehrmacht officers honored in Austria for resistance against the Nazi regime. In the days following the battle, the French prisoners, American liberators, and German defectors interacted in ways that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. The conversations. Paul Renault, former Prime Minister of France, reportedly had long conversations with the Wehrmacht soldiers about the war, about Germany's descent into Nazism, about the choices individuals made. Some Wehrmacht soldiers apologized for the war and the suffering Germany had caused. Others tried to explain how they'd ended up fighting for a regime they'd come to despise. The Americans, initially wary of their temporary German allies, developed grudging respect for soldiers who'd risked their lives to protect prisoners from their own former comrades. The recognition. The French government later considered how to acknowledge the Wehrmacht soldiers who'd helped defend Castle Itter. This created an awkward diplomatic problem. How do you honor enemy soldiers who fought against their own side? The Légion d'honneur, France's highest decoration, was considered but never awarded, likely because the political implications of honoring Wehrmacht soldiers were too complicated. Gangel was eventually honored by Austrian local government, though never officially by the German government. The moral complexity. The Battle of Castle Itter created moral complexity that participants struggled with for years. Were the Wehrmacht soldiers heroes for defecting, or simply doing their basic moral duty? Should American soldiers have allied with Germans even briefly, or was this a betrayal of those who'd died fighting the Wehrmacht? How should the French prisoners feel about being defended by German soldiers? What did this say about individual moral responsibility in warfare? There were no easy answers. Most participants concluded that the situation was unique, circumstances so extraordinary that normal rules didn't apply. When SS fanatics were trying to murder prisoners after the war had effectively ended, cooperating with defecting Wehrmacht soldiers to prevent a massacre was justified. But the moral questions lingered. The Battle of Castle Itter raises fascinating questions about loyalty, fanaticism, and the end of wars. Question 1. Why did the SS attack? By May 5, 1945, the war was over in every meaningful sense. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, German forces were surrendering across Europe, the Nazi regime had collapsed. Why would SS troops attack a castle to murder prisoners when defeat was inevitable? Several factors likely contributed: ideological fanaticism. The SS had been indoctrinated to believe in Nazi ideology so thoroughly that accepting defeat was psychologically impossible. If the war was lost, it must be because of traitors and enemies within, like the French prisoners. Revenge. The prisoners represented allied nations that had defeated Germany. Murdering them was a final act of defiance and revenge. Elimination of witnesses. Some SS troops may have feared that prominent prisoners like Daladier and Renault would testify about Nazi crimes. Killing them eliminated potential witnesses. Nihilism. With the regime collapsed and their own futures uncertain, some SS troops may have embraced violence as a final act of meaning in a collapsing world. Question 2. Should Gangl and the Wehrmacht soldiers be considered heroes? This remains controversial. Arguments in favor that they defied orders and risked their lives to protect prisoners. Gangl died fighting against SS fanatics. They chose humanity over loyalty to a criminal regime. They demonstrated that individual Germans could resist even at the war's end. Arguments against they'd served the Nazi regime for years before defecting. Defecting only when Germany's defeat was inevitable suggests opportunism rather than principled resistance. One brave act doesn't erase years of service to an evil regime. Calling Wehrmacht soldiers heroes minimizes the crimes Germany committed. Most historians recognize Gangl and his men as having done the right thing in this specific circumstance, while acknowledging that this doesn't absolve them of their broader complicity in the war. Question 3. What does this battle tell us about the end of wars? The Battle of Kassel-Itter demonstrates that wars don't end cleanly. Even after governments surrender, individual soldiers may continue fighting from ideology, revenge, confusion, refusal to accept defeat. This pattern has repeated in modern conflicts. When states collapse or surrender, armed groups often continue fighting, creating chaotic transition periods where allegiances fragment and violence becomes unpredictable. Question 4. Why isn't this battle better known? The Battle of Kassel-Itter is relatively obscure despite its extraordinary circumstances. Several factors contributed. It happened after the war was essentially over, making it seem like an afterthought. It involved small numbers of troops, not major formations. The moral complexity, Americans fighting alongside Germans, made it difficult to fit into simple narratives. Post-war politics made both Germany and France uncomfortable, highlighting Wehrmacht soldiers defending French prisoners. But it deserves to be better known precisely because of its complexity and its demonstration of individual moral choice. Today, Kassel-Itter operates as a private residence. There's a small memorial plaque commemorating the battle, and the street leading to it is named after Major Gangl. But for most people, even in Austria, the battle is unknown or forgotten. The French prisoners who were rescued lived out their lives, some returning to politics, others to private life. Most died decades ago, taking their memories of the strange day when Germans and Americans fought together to protect them. The American soldiers received commendations, but not major recognition. For them, it was one more crazy incident in a war full of crazy incidents. The Wehrmacht soldiers who survived disappeared into post-war Germany, their role in the battle largely unacknowledged. The Battle of Kassel-Itter was absurd. American and German soldiers fighting side by side against other Germans. A French tennis champion running through machine gun fire to get help. Former prime ministers manning rifles. A Wehrmacht officer dying to protect French prisoners from his own countrymen. All of this happening after the war had effectively ended, in a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps, because a small group of SS fanatics refused to accept that their ideology had been defeated. It shouldn't have happened. The war should have been over. The prisoners should have been safe. But fanaticism doesn't respect logic, and wars don't end cleanly. There's a photograph from after the battle showing American soldiers, French prisoners, and Wehrmacht soldiers standing together near Kassel-Itter. They're not quite smiling. The battle was too recent, too dangerous, too strange for celebration. But they're standing together, unlikely allies who'd survived something impossible. The photograph captures a unique moment. Enemies becoming temporary allies when circumstances demanded it. individuals choosing humanity over ideology, soldiers defying their own side when their side demanded murder. It's messy, it's complicated, it doesn't fit simple narratives about good and evil, but it happened. And it reminds us that even in history's darkest moments, individual humans can make choices that transcend the madness around them. Major Gangle chose to defect and protect prisoners. Captain Lee chose to accept unlikely allies. The French prisoners chose to fight rather than wait passively for rescue. These choices mattered. They prevented a massacre. They saved lives, and they created the strangest battle of World War II. A battle that shouldn't have been necessary, fought by an alliance that shouldn't have been possible at a castle that shouldn't have been a battlefield. If this story fascinated you, if it made you think about loyalty and defection, about wars that refuse to end, about enemies who become allies, hit that subscribe button. The Battle of Castle Itter is forgotten by most of the world, but the lessons it teaches about individual moral choice in impossible circumstances remain relevant. The war was over. The fighting should have stopped. But at Castle Itter on May 5th, 1945, Americans, Germans, and French fought together one last time. And they won.